The phone rang at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in October 2018, and I remember the time because I'd been dreaming about something mundane, a high school reunion, maybe, or some forgotten face from my past, when the sound pulled me from sleep like a hook through water, sharp and insistent and wrong, because nobody calls at that hour with good news. And my wife rolled over and mumbled something unintelligible into her pillow while I grabbed the phone, saw my mother's name on the screen, and felt my stomach drop before I even said hello, because when your mother calls you at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, you know something has happened, something that cannot wait until morning, something that will change things forever. And what happened was that the FBI had just left her house after asking questions about my grandfather, Joseph Harold McKinney, born in 1938 in Coal Creek, West Virginia. Population 1,200 on a good day, who grew up in a house with no indoor plumbing until well into the 1950s, whose father died of black lung disease at 49 after spending his whole life underground in the mines, who joined the army in 1956 to escape that same fate, who came home with a GED and a bad knee from a training accident that kept him out of Vietnam, who made his way to Cleveland, Ohio by 1965 where he got a job at a Ford assembly plant working the line like thousands of other men chasing the American dream, who met my grandmother Dorothy who worked in the cafeteria serving coffee and pie to hungry workers, who married her in 1966 in a small ceremony with just family present, who had my uncle in 1968, my aunt in 1970, and my mother in 1973, who worked his way up to supervisor after 20 years of showing up early and staying late, who bought a house in the suburbs with a backyard and a garage and a swing set for the kids, who lived there for 40 years attending church every Sunday and golfing every Saturday and never missing a single school play or baseball game, who died of a heart attack in 2006 2 weeks after his 68th birthday while planting tomatoes in his garden, the gentlest man I ever knew who taught me to fish at age 5 and showed up to every single one of my baseball games, even the ones where I sat on the bench the whole time and never complained and always had something encouraging to say afterward, who slipped me $20 bills when my parents weren't looking and told me not to tell grandma and winked like we were partners in crime, who never raised his voice at anyone except that one time a neighbor's dog kept digging up his garden and even then he just stomped his foot and said, "Darn it," which was as close to cursing as he ever got, who never talked about his life before Ohio and never went back to West Virginia not once in 40 years, and when we asked why he said there was nothing left for him there and we accepted that answer because lots of people from that generation were like that, they didn't dwell on the past, they looked forward, they built new lives and left the old ones behind, and we never questioned it, never pushed, never wondered why a man wouldn't want to show his grandchildren where he grew up, never thought to ask what he might be running from, who had a temper sometimes that would flare for a few seconds when someone cut him off in traffic or when things didn't go his way, a look in his eyes that wasn't quite anger but something else, something older and deeper. And then he'd catch himself and take a deep breath and walk away, and my grandmother used to say, "Your grandpa's got a fire inside him, he just learned how to put it out," and I thought she meant the Irish temper we'd heard about from relatives, thought nothing of it because everybody's got moments, right, and I didn't know she was talking about something much darker, something that had happened long before any of us. But on that October night my mother told me the FBI agents had shown up at her door at 10 p.m., a man and a woman in dark suits that screamed, "Government," even before they showed their badges, who apologized for the late hour and said they had questions about Joseph McKinney. And my mother, thinking they meant my father, who is also named Joseph though everyone calls him Joe Jr., invited them in and offered coffee because that's what you do when federal agents show up at your door, you invite them in and offer coffee and try to figure out what's happening, until they clarified they meant the senior, her father who'd been dead for 12 years, and they told her they'd been looking for him for 54 years and needed to understand his life before he moved to Ohio, and when she asked what he'd done the male agent, Agent Morrison, said, "Ma'am, your father was involved in an incident in 1964 that resulted in a man's death," and my mother sat down hard on the couch and said, "That's impossible, my father was the gentlest man I ever knew, he wouldn't hurt a fly, there must be some mistake," and the agents just looked at her with those patient federal agent faces and said there was no mistake, they had evidence, they needed answers, and they asked questions for 2 hours. "Did your father ever mention living in Kentucky?" "No." "Did he ever talk about a man named Vernon Cox?" "No." "Did he ever mention a bar called the Rusty Nail?" "No." Did he ever seem afraid of being found? No. Did he ever use a different name? No. Did he have any unexplained injuries when you were growing up? No. Did he ever suddenly need to leave town for a while? No. And by the end my mother was in tears and the agents left their cards and said they'd be in touch, and she called me at 3:47 a.m. and told me everything, and I told her that was impossible because Grandpa was the gentlest person we knew. But here's the thing about family secrets that I learned over the next 6 months: they only stay secret because we want them to. Because we don't ask the hard questions, because we accept the convenient answers, because we'd rather believe in the person we love than dig for a truth that might destroy everything we thought we knew. And I was about to start digging. I was about to learn that my grandfather had been a wanted fugitive for 54 years, that a bar fight in 1964 had turned him into a killer, that he built an entire life on a lie, and that the FBI finally caught up with him 12 years after he died, and none of us ever suspected a thing. The next morning I called Special Agent Delgado and told her I was a journalist, which was true. I'd spent 10 years as a reporter for various newspapers before switching to content marketing. I still had contacts, I still knew how to research, and I needed to understand what was happening to my family. And she was polite but guarded. Confirmed that Joseph McKinney was a person of interest in a 1964 homicide in eastern Kentucky, but wouldn't give me details, citing an ongoing investigation. Said they'd been reviewing cold cases and new evidence had emerged linking my grandfather to the scene. Said they were trying to determine the exact circumstances of Vernon Cox's death, and when I asked why they were only looking for him now if he was a fugitive since he died in 2006, she said, "We didn't know his name until last month," which made no sense at the time but would eventually. So I hung up and started doing what I do best, research, but finding information about a 1964 homicide in eastern Kentucky in the age of the internet is harder than you'd think. Most small-town newspapers from that era aren't digitized, police records are spotty, people die and move away and forget, so I tried newspaper archives for the Pike County News and the Lexington Herald Leader and the Louisville Courier-Journal, searched every variation I could think of: Vernon Cox death, Vernie Cox killed, Pike County homicide 1964, Rusty Nail Bar incident. Got nothing. Tried Ancestry.com looking for Vernon Cox in Kentucky death records, found 3 possibilities, none of them in the right time frame. Tried FBI databases and FOIA requests and anything I could think of, dead end after dead end, until I remembered something Agent Delgado had said. New evidence meant there was old evidence too, and old evidence meant old records, and old records meant the courthouse. So I flew to Lexington, rented a car, and drove 3 hours east through highway that narrowed to 2 lanes and wound through mountain passes where cell service dropped to nothing and the hills rose up on both sides like walls, past coal trucks and tiny churches and houses that looked like they'd been there for 100 years with clotheslines in the yards and dogs sleeping on porches and old men sitting in rocking chairs watching the world go by, past signs for hollers and creeks with names I couldn't pronounce, through country that felt like it existed outside of time. Until I reached Pikeville and the Pike County Courthouse, a modest brick building in the center of town with a clock tower that hadn't worked in decades and American flags snapping in the wind, where I walked in on a Tuesday morning, found the county clerk's office, and asked to see records from 1964, and a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain and the patient expression of someone who deals with confused people all day disappeared into a back room and came back 20 minutes later with a cardboard box covered in dust so thick it left smudges on my fingers, and she said, "This is all we've got from that year. Most of it's on microfilm now, but this box never got processed. Take a look." And I sat at a wooden table scarred with decades of use and opened the box to find folders with handwritten labels in fading ink. And I started pulling them out one by one, scanning for anything that said Cox or homicide or Rusty Nail, my heart pounding with each folder I opened and set aside, and then I found it, a manila folder thin as a few sheets of paper with the tab in careful cursive reading, Commonwealth vs. Unknown Male, Death of Vernon Cox, Unknown Male. That's what they called my grandfather for 54 years, a nameless ghost who killed a man and disappeared, and I opened it with shaking hands. The folder contained 4 documents that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. The first was a death certificate for Vernon Earl Cox, born March 12, 1932, died August 17, 1964, cause of death blunt force trauma to the head, place of death the Rusty Nail Tavern, Virgie, Kentucky, informant his mother Ethel Cox, who reported her son's death with the kind of clinical detachment that suggested she'd already done her crying in private. The second was a witness statement from a man named Luther Hatfield, bartender at the Rusty Nail, dated August 18, 1964, typed on onion skin paper so thin it was almost transparent, describing a fight that started around 11 p.m. the night before, where a stranger came in around 10:30, sat at the bar, ordered a beer. Vernie Cox had been there since maybe 8, drinking pretty heavy, and started in on the stranger, calling him names, saying he wasn't from around here. What was he doing here? Stranger tried to ignore him. Vernie kept at it. Around 11 Vernie got up and went over to where the stranger was sitting and grabbed his arm and said they needed to go outside and settle things. Stranger said he didn't want no trouble. Vernie swung at him. Stranger ducked. Vernie fell and hit his head on the edge of the bar on the way down. Wasn't no weapon. Wasn't no fight really. Vernie just fell wrong. Stranger tried to help him but Vernie wasn't moving. Someone called the ambulance but it was too late. Stranger was gone when the police got there. The third document was a sheriff's report confirming the bartender's account and adding that 4 other witnesses all told the same story, that Vernon Cox had been the aggressor and the stranger had acted in self-defense. No charges were recommended. Case closed pending identification of the unknown male. And the fourth document answered why my grandfather was a fugitive all those years, a handwritten letter dated September 3, 1964 from the county prosecutor to the sheriff on official letterhead with the ink faded to brown, saying, "Dear Sheriff Combs, I have reviewed the statements in the matter of the death of Vernon Cox. While it appears the unknown individual acted in self-defense, the fact remains that a man is dead and the individual responsible fled the scene before law enforcement arrived. Leaving the scene of a fatal incident is itself a crime. Moreover, we cannot definitively rule out greater culpability without interviewing this individual. I am therefore directing you to locate and question him regarding the events of August 17th. If he fails to come forward voluntarily, we will have no choice but to seek an indictment for manslaughter and flight to avoid prosecution. Respectfully, Howard T. Chandler, Pike County Prosecutor." And I read that letter 3 times sitting in that dusty courthouse with the afternoon light streaming through windows that hadn't been washed since the Johnson administration, understanding that my grandfather hadn't killed anyone intentionally, not really. He'd been attacked, defended himself, watched his attacker fall and die, then panicked and ran because he was 26 years old and scared and didn't know what else to do. But here's the thing about 1964 in eastern Kentucky that you have to understand. A stranger killing a local man even in self-defense was a dangerous situation. The Cox family had lived in Pike County for 5 generations with cousins and uncles and in-laws spread across 3 counties. They were coal people, mountain people, the kind of people who settled things themselves without waiting for courts and judges, and if my grandfather had stayed and tried to explain, there's a real chance he wouldn't have made it to trial because vigilante justice was still a thing in those mountains. People disappeared in hollers and were never found, so he ran all the way to Ohio. But then I pulled out my phone and started searching Joseph McKinney, West Virginia. Birth records, Joseph McKinney, Kentucky, anything, and found a marriage license from 1958 for Joseph McKinney, age 20, to Mary Lou Whitaker, age 18, in Pike County, Kentucky, meaning my grandfather had been married before to a woman none of us had ever heard of, meaning he hadn't just fled the scene of a death, he'd fled his whole life, his wife, his past, his identity, and started over from scratch. Mary Lou Whitaker McKinney died in 2015 at age 75. I learned from an online obituary that took me 3 days to find. Never remarried, never had children, lived her whole life in a small house outside Pikeville on a road called Whitaker Hollow where her family had lived for 100 years, worked as a cashier at the Piggly Wiggly for 40 years. And was buried in the cemetery behind the Methodist church with an obituary mentioning no surviving family, just cousins and friends and fellow church members, but the marriage license I'd found told me she'd been married to Joseph McKinney for 6 years from 1958 to 1964, meaning my grandfather had been married to her when he left Kentucky, when he went to that bar, when Vernon Cox died, and he hadn't just left, he'd disappeared without a word, without a goodbye, without ever telling her where he was going or why. leaving her to wonder for the rest of her life what happened to the man she married, so I needed to talk to someone who knew Mary Lou, and her obituary mentioned a close friend named Evelyn Sparks, also of Pikeville, and I found a phone number through a genealogy website and called, and Evelyn answered on the third ring with a voice thin and reedy from age but sharp as a tack, and when I explained who I was and what I was looking for, she was quiet for a long moment before saying, "I wondered if someone would come asking someday." Mary Lou never talked about it much, but she told me once when we'd had a few glasses of wine about her husband who just up and disappeared one night in 1964, never came home, never called. She waited for him for months, thought he must be dead, finally filed for divorce in 1965 on grounds of abandonment, and I asked if she knew what happened, if she knew about the bar fight, and Evelyn said she knew something happened. The sheriff came around asking questions, but she didn't know where he'd gone. She thought maybe he was dead. I think a part of her always hoped he'd come back. She never stopped loving him. Even though he left, she used to say he was the best thing that ever happened to her, and then he was gone like smoke, and I told Evelyn what I'd learned, the bar fight, the death, the flight to Ohio, and she said, "Lord have mercy, he wasn't a bad man then, just a scared one, just a boy really, 26 years old and scared out of his mind." And I said he was my grandfather and he was a good man, the best, and I didn't understand why he never came back or never told anyone, and Evelyn said, "Fear, fear and shame, he ran and then he kept running, after a while it's too late to go back, too much time has passed, too many lies have been told, so you just keep living the lie until it becomes the truth, until you forget there was ever anything else." I flew back to Ohio with more questions than answers, but at least now I knew the basic shape of the story. My grandfather wasn't a killer in the way I'd feared. He was a man who'd made a terrible mistake defending himself and then made another terrible mistake by running, but if the prosecutor had decided not to charge him and the witnesses all said it was self-defense, why was the FBI involved 54 years later with new evidence and new witnesses? So I called Agent Delgado again and told her I'd been doing research and knew about the bar fight and Vernon Cox and that my grandfather acted in self-defense and panicked, and asked why they were still investigating. And after a long pause she said, "Mr. McKinney, the self-defense finding was based entirely on witness statements from that night, but we've recently located a new witness, someone who wasn't interviewed in 1964, a man named Carl Cox, Vernon's younger brother. He was 17 at the time. He wasn't at the bar that night, but he arrived shortly after the ambulance left and he saw something the other witnesses didn't. He saw your grandfather standing over Vernon's body with a piece of pipe in his hand, and the words hit me like a physical blow. I said, "That's not what the other witnesses said. They said he fell. They said there was no weapon," and she said, "I'm aware of that, and for 54 years that's what everyone believed, but Carl Cox is 71 now, he's dying of cancer, he has maybe 6 months left, and he's been telling anyone who'll listen that his brother was murdered, that the man who killed him got away. He's been trying to get someone to investigate for decades, writing letters, making phone calls, nobody listened because the case was closed and everyone was dead. Finally last month he contacted the FBI and he had evidence, a letter written by his mother in 1964. She wrote it to the prosecutor at the time but she never sent it. She was afraid of what might happen if she spoke up, afraid for her family, afraid for herself, so she kept it, hid it in a Bible for 21 years. And on her deathbed in 1985 she gave it to Carl and told him to use it if he ever needed to prove the truth, and the letter said that Vernon Cox wasn't a perfect man, he drank too much, he got into fights, he was difficult and angry and hard to love, but he was her son and she knew he didn't just fall and hit his head. She said he'd been in plenty of fights, fallen plenty of times, and never once died from it. She said the stranger, your grandfather, hit him with something. She didn't know what, a pipe or a bottle or something heavy, but she knew. A mother knows these things. A mother feels it in her bones when her child has been wronged, and my head was spinning. I said, but the bartender and the other witnesses all said it was an accident, and she said bartender was Carl Cox's uncle, Luther Hatfield was Ethel's brother, the other witnesses were all related to the Cox family somehow, cousins and in-laws and friends who depended on the Cox family for work and protection. We're re-interviewing them now. Some are dead, some are too old to remember clearly, but one, a woman named Betty Lou Caudle who was 19 at the time and Working as a waitress at the Rusty Nail, she's still alive, 83 years old in a nursing home in Hazard, and she's recanting her original statement, says she was pressured by family to say it was an accident, says what she really saw was your grandfather hit Vernon with a pipe that was lying near the bar after Vernon was already on the ground, and I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I said I need to see that letter and she said she couldn't show me its evidence in an ongoing investigation. I said I need to talk to Carl Cox and she said she couldn't arrange that, he's too sick and under doctor's care. I said then what can you do? My grandfather is dead, he's been dead for 12 years, whatever happened in that bar he's beyond your reach, so what do you want from my family? And she said, we want the truth, Mr. McKinney, that's all we've ever wanted. And if the truth is that your grandfather killed a man and got away with it for 54 years, then his victims, Vernon's family, deserve to have that truth acknowledged, even if there can never be justice, even if everyone involved is dead, because the truth matters, it always matters. I couldn't let it go. I spent the next month digging deeper than I'd ever dug before in my entire career as a journalist. I found Betty Lou Caudle, now Betty Lou Sizemore, living in a nursing home in Hazard, Kentucky, a facility called Mountain View Manor that sat on a hill overlooking the town, and I drove 6 hours from Ohio through rain and fog and winding mountain roads to see her, and she was 83 years old, sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued despite her age, sitting in a wheelchair by the window of her room with a blanket over her lap and a photograph of her grandchildren on the nightstand, and when I introduced myself as Joseph McKinney's grandson she stared at me for a long moment with eyes that hadn't lost their acuity and said, "You got his eyes, same color, same shape." I remember those eyes looking at me that night right after it happened, like he was asking me what he'd just done, and I sat down across from her and asked if she could tell me what she saw that night. And she looked out the window at the hills she'd known her whole life and said, "I've been carrying this for 54 years, told myself it didn't matter, told myself he probably had it coming, Vernie I mean, he was a mean drunk, always starting trouble, always looking for a fight. Everybody in 3 counties knew to stay away from Vernie Cox when he'd been drinking, but he didn't deserve to die, nobody deserves that, not even a man like Vernie," and she told me Vernie was running his mouth like always and my grandpa was just sitting there minding his own business, a stranger passing through, maybe looking for work or just passing through on his way somewhere else. Vernie kept at him and finally grabbed his arm and tried to drag him outside. My grandpa pulled away. Vernie swung and missed and fell against the bar and hit his head, and then she stopped and closed her eyes and I could see her remembering, could see the scene playing out behind her eyelids after all these years, and I asked what happened next, and she said, "And then your grandpa picked up a piece of pipe that was lying on the floor behind the bar. I don't know why it was there, maybe someone had been fixing something, maybe it fell off the shelf, but he picked it up, and when Vernie tried to get up, when he was on his hands and knees trying to stand, your grandpa hit him once, right on the side of the head, and Vernie went down and didn't get up, and your grandpa just stood there looking at him for a second like he couldn't believe what he'd done, and then he dropped the pipe and ran out the back door, and that was the last anybody saw of him until now." And I asked if he hit him on purpose and she said, "It looked that way to me, but I was the only one looking. Everyone else was watching Vernie fall, watching him hit the bar, but I was watching your grandpa. I saw his face change, saw something happen behind his eyes, and then he picked up that pipe and swung it, and I asked why she didn't tell anyone at the time, and she laughed a bitter sound that turned into a cough and said, "You know where we are? Eastern Kentucky, 1964, the Cox family ran this county like their own personal kingdom. My daddy worked for them in the mines, my brothers worked for them. If I'd said anything against them my whole family would have suffered, we would have lost our jobs, lost our home, maybe worse, so I kept my mouth shut, we all did. We told the sheriff what we were supposed to tell him, and your grandpa disappeared and I thought that was the end of it until Carl started stirring things up 50 years later. And I said maybe he didn't know, maybe he never knew he hit him and probably thought Vernie died from the fall, and she said maybe, or maybe he knew exactly what he did and ran anyway because he knew what would happen if he stayed. You can't blame a man for running when his life is on the line, and I wanted to argue with her, defend him, tell her he was a good man who made a mistake, but I couldn't because I didn't know and I'd never know, and the only person who could tell me the truth had been dead for 12 years and taken that truth with him to his grave. Before I left, Betty Lou handed me something, a folded piece of paper so old it was brown at the edges, and she said Carl Cox died last week, cancer finally took him after months of suffering. His daughter found this among his things when she was cleaning out his house and didn't know what to do with it, and Betty Lou told her she knew someone who might want to see it, someone who deserved to know the whole story, and it was the letter. The one Carl's mother Ethel wrote in 1964 but never sent. The one she'd given him on her deathbed with instructions to use it if he ever needed to prove the truth, and I read it sitting in my rental car in the nursing home parking lot with rain starting to fall on the windshield, and it said, August 20, 1964, to Prosecutor Chandler, I am writing this letter that I will probably never send because I need someone to know the truth. My boy Vernie is dead and I know how it happened because my brother Luther told me what really happened before he told the sheriff. Luther is the bartender at the Rusty Nail. He's my brother and I love him, but he's a coward. He told me the stranger hit Vernie with a pipe after Vernie was already down. Hit him hard. Luther saw it. So did some others. But they all agreed to say Vernie fell because they're afraid of what might happen if they tell the truth. The Cox family has been here a long time and we have a lot of friends, but we also have a lot of enemies, and Luther is afraid that if he tells the truth, someone will come after him or his family. I understand that fear. I share it. But I also know that my son is dead and the man who killed him is walking around free somewhere, and that isn't right. I don't know who he is. I don't know where he came from. But I know what he did. And I know that if you read this, you'll have to decide what to do with it. I'm leaving that up to you. I've done what I can. Sincerely, Ethel Cox. And I sat in that car for a long time holding a dead woman's confession, a mother's desperate attempt to tell the truth about her son's death, written 64 years ago and never seen by anyone until now, and everything I thought I knew about my grandfather, the gentle grandfather who taught me to fish and showed up to every baseball game and slipped me $20 bills. The patient teacher who never raised his voice and always had time for me, the quiet man who never talked about his past and never went back home. All of it collapsed in that moment, or maybe it didn't collapse, maybe it just became more complicated, because people aren't one thing, they're not all good or all bad, they're just people capable of terrible things and wonderful things sometimes in the same lifetime. Capable of killing a man in a moment of fear and anger and then spending the next 54 years being the best grandfather anyone could ask for, and my grandfather was a killer and he was also the man who taught me to fish, and both of those things were true and I had to find a way to hold them both. I gave the letter to Agent Delgado, she thanked me, told me the investigation would continue, said they'd be in touch if they needed anything else, and I never heard from her again, but I did hear from the Cox family, Vernon's daughter, his only child born 2 months after he died, who found me through a genealogist she'd hired to research her family history. Her name was Patricia Cox Holbrook. She was 63 years old, living in Florida in a retirement community outside Tampa, a retired schoolteacher with 3 children and 6 grandchildren, and she'd never known her father, never even seen a photograph of him because her mother burned them all after he died. All she had was her mother's bitter stories about a man who drank too much and couldn't hold a job and died in a bar fight before she was born, leaving her pregnant and alone and ashamed. And we talked on the phone for 2 hours, and she didn't blame me, didn't blame my grandfather really. Because what was the point after all these years? He was dead, her father was dead, all that was left was 2 families trying to make sense of something that happened before most of them were born. And she said, I used to imagine him, my father, I used to imagine what he looked like, what his voice sounded like, whether he would have loved me, whether he would have been proud of me. My mother never talked about him except to say he was no good. I think she was ashamed of how he died. Ashamed that he was in a bar when he had a pregnant wife at home, ashamed that she'd married a man like that. I grew up feeling like I had to be ashamed of him too, like his blood in my veins was something to hide, and I told her she didn't have to be ashamed, none of this was her fault, she was just as much a victim as anyone, and she said, I know that now, but it took a long time, and finding out the truth, even a truth as ugly as this, it helped, because now I know, now I can stop imagining and start accepting. Now I can visit his grave without wondering who he was, and I told her about my grandfather, about the life he built in Ohio, about the family he raised, about how he never talked about his past, never went back to West Virginia or Kentucky, never mentioned a first wife or a dead man in a bar, and I said, he was running the whole time, for 54 years he was running, and we never knew, we never suspected a thing, and she said, he must have been so lonely, carrying that secret all those years, never able to tell anyone, never able to go home, never able to be truly known by the people who loved him, and I'd never thought of it that way. I'd been so focused on the betrayal, the lie he'd told all of us, that I hadn't considered what it cost him, to build a life on a foundation of sand, to love people while knowing that if they ever learned the truth that love might turn to horror, to die with a secret burning inside you that you could never confess. And I said slowly, I think he did the best he could with what he had. It wasn't right. What he did to Vernon wasn't right, and running wasn't right, and lying to us for 40 years wasn't right, but he was 26 years old, he was scared, he made a terrible choice, and then he spent the rest of his life paying for it in ways we'll never fully understand. And she asked, paying for it how? And I said, by never being able to be fully known, by always holding something back, by loving us but never letting us love all of him, by dying alone with his secret because he couldn't share it even with the people who loved him most. I visited my grandfather's grave for the first time in years last spring, on a sunny Sunday morning with birds singing and the smell of cut grass in the air. He's buried in a small cemetery outside Cleveland called Evergreen Memorial Gardens, next to my grandmother who died 5 years after him, her headstone matching his. The grass is always green there and someone leaves flowers on holidays. And the headstone is simple gray granite with his name and dates, Joseph H. McKinney, 1938 to 2006, and below that, beloved husband and father. And I stood there for a long time looking at those words, beloved. He was beloved, by me, by my mother, by everyone who knew him as the gentle grandfather who taught us to fish and showed up to every baseball game and slipped us $20 bills and never had a bad word to say about anyone. But he was also something else that headstone doesn't say, something that can never be carved in stone, and I don't know how to hold both of those truths at the same time. Maybe I never will. Maybe that's the point of life, that we don't get to resolve the people we love into neat categories of good and bad. We just have to love them and grieve them and accept that we never fully knew them, that there are always parts of people we'll never see, secrets they'll take to their graves. And before I left I did something I hadn't planned, something that felt necessary even though I couldn't explain why. I drove 7 hours from Cleveland back to Pike County, Kentucky, found the small cemetery behind the Baptist church where Vernon Cox is buried, a neglected plot with weeds growing around the stones and no flowers on any of the graves, and his marker is simple, a small gray stone with his name and dates worn by weather and time, Vernon E. Cox, 1932 to 1964, nothing else, no beloved, no father, no husband, just a name. And 2 numbers and the silence of 64 years, and I stood there too for a different long moment and said out loud to a man I never met who died 28 years before I was born, I'm sorry for what my grandfather did, I'm sorry you never got to see your daughter grow up, I'm sorry you never got to meet your grandchildren, I'm sorry your family carried this pain for so long, I'm sorry for all of it. And the wind moved through the trees and a bird called somewhere nearby and no thunderbolt struck me down and no voice answered from the sky, just the quiet of a Kentucky cemetery and the weight of a 64-year-old secret finally spoken aloud. And on my way out of town I stopped at a diner for lunch, the same diner where I'd eaten on my first trip to Pike County, and the same waitress was there, a different day but the same woman, and she asked where I was from and I told her Ohio. And she asked what brought me to Pike County and I said, family history, I have roots here. And she nodded like that made perfect sense and said, lots of people come through here for that, we got deep roots in these hills, family's been here for generations. And I said, yeah, we have too, I just didn't know it until recently. The FBI investigation into Joseph McKinney's role in the death of Vernon Cox was officially closed in 2019 with a finding that McKinney caused Cox's death by striking him with a metal pipe following a physical altercation at the Rusty Nail Tavern in Virgie, Kentucky on August 17, 1964, and because both parties are deceased, no further action will be taken. Case closed after 55 years. And the case file is public record now, anyone can request it through FOIA. Anyone can read the witness statements and the letters and the forensic reports and the agent notes, anyone can piece together what happened that night in a smoky bar in eastern Kentucky when a 26-year-old man made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life and beyond. But those documents don't tell the whole story. They can't, because the whole story isn't in police reports and court records. It's in the hearts of the people who were affected. It's in the daughter who never knew her father, in the wife who waited for a man who never came home, in the grandchildren trying to reconcile the man they loved with the man they never knew. That's what stories are for, the ones we tell ourselves and the ones we tell each other and the ones we tell long after the people involved are gone, trying to make sense of something that never will make sense, trying to find meaning in tragedy, trying to hold on to love even when we've discovered that the person we loved wasn't who we thought they were. And my grandfather was a killer and he was also a good man, and both of those things are true, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to understand how a man can do something terrible and then spend 54 years being something wonderful, trying to understand how a family can survive such a revelation, trying to understand what any of it means. And maybe there is no understanding, maybe there's only acceptance, only the simple fact that people are complicated and life is messy and secrets have a way of surfacing no matter how deep you bury them. And all we can do is tell the truth when it finally comes to light, acknowledge the pain, and try to move forward with a little more wisdom and a little more compassion than we had before.